For this week's history video, I'd like to continue the exploration of the most interesting or strange presidential transitions in recent history. 1960 has to qualify when John Kennedy met with Dwight Eisenhower and found out that his whole campaign was based on a false premise. Kennedy's campaign was all based on the concept that America was falling behind, that there was a missile gap, that Russia was forging ahead of the United States, and that America had to race to catch up and regird our strength so that we could become competitive with the Russians again. And that narrative was fueled by Sputnik, the satellite the Russians launched in 1957, and then a follow-up one that they launched later in that decade, when the United States was still having rockets that exploded 3 feet off the launching pad at Cape Canaveral. And the legacy of the failure of the American missile program and the Russians launching satellites, one of which had a dog in it, Laika, was really graphic evidence, Americans felt. Also, Khrushchev would delight in exploding 50 and 100 megaton bombs, gigantic hydrogen bombs, huge amounts of fallout. Nobody knew much about fallout back then. And these bombs seemed so much larger than the American bombs. Now, Eisenhower had resisted congressional demands for increased defense spending, and the Democrats were pushing hard for more spending on defense and on missiles and on space and all of that. And Eisenhower, as the old general, knew full well what the reality was, that the United States had far more weapons than Russia did and had an enormous lead in anything that really mattered. Eisenhower understood that putting a satellite in orbit had relatively little to do with a massive nuclear blow, and that was the United States, largely through its ring of bases around the Soviet Union, could demolish every inch of the Soviet Union. Russia couldn't lay a glove on the United States. It couldn't touch any American city. They just didn't have rockets that went that far. They had intermediate range rockets of 2,000 or 3,000 miles. They could hit Europe, but not intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that could go 5,000 or 10,000 miles over the pole and come down and hit the United States. But Eisenhower never made a point of that. He never talked about that in public. He never berated Khrushchev. And when Khrushchev talked about bigger and bigger bombs, he never pointed out that you need to deliver the bombs and that the Russians had no way of doing that. And the reason he didn't was that he did not want to undermine Khrushchev in the Kremlin. He knew that there was a big debate going on between the hawks and the others in the Kremlin about whether they should dramatically increase their military production and their missile research. And he wanted Khrushchev, who was opposed to that, to win, because he knew that it would cost, and Khrushchev took that position because he knew that this increased expenditure would bankrupt the Soviet Union and lead to the implosion that ultimately did happen. So Eisenhower stopped rebutting the Democratic charges and basically didn't specify how far in advance of Russia we were. And since he was Eisenhower, the general who won World War II, people were inclined to believe him and took him at his word. But then when Kennedy campaigned on the missile gap, he struck a responsive chord, and that helped him defeat Nixon and become president. But when he sat down with Eisenhower in the transition, he found out it wasn't true. He found out that the reality was far different, that there was a gigantic missile gap and that Russia was way, way behind the United States. And that posed a real problem for him, which is how did he talk his way out of the problem he talked his way into. Thanks for watching.